All right, so slightly different style. This time you're gonna have to wait for your clickbait instead of getting it up front. But today we're gonna be covering the LLM provider compatible APIs from Palantir and how you can use that with the AI SDK through this package that I've recently open sourced. So what exactly are we talking about and why should you care? Well, Palantir has negotiations with the major providers and they serve up private ZDR versions of the major LLMs, and they've recently made that available through the provider's own default SDK, which means all of the great training data from all the published documentation, all that is now going to be there, and the models are going to be a lot better at writing this. They're going to be a lot more current, and there's a whole lot of other benefits, but we'll talk through that, or more like show that as we go. So I'll have to thank Dorian for actually working with Palantir to go test this and make sure all of this was working and hardened. I saw his video and then I immediately started working on this package, but you can watch this if you're interested. But let's dig into kind of why this is as important and why you should actually care about just an NPM package. Well, before like DevCon 5, and I'm considering this before DevCon 5, I know they announced it way back when, but it's finally available now. But you can, if you're trying to use LLMs, right, you have a couple of options previously, right? You could use it within Foundry, but you're stuck with their version of like an SDK that they have published, which was different by provider, had a lot of features missing, like streaming, and just you're never going to be as current. You're never going to have as good of an experience. And if you're trying to use like an AI to write that, you're going to have a lot harder time because the models are not trained nearly to the extent that they are on like the provider's own spec. Okay. The other option was to negotiate directly with the provider and like reverse proxy it through like light LLM. This is usually not a good developer experience for developers. Yes, it's secure. Yes, you have your own like capacity limitations, but like that is heavily reliant on your IT actually managing these negotiations. And the downside is they don't always do that with all of the different labs, and so you're usually just constrained to one like category of model or the other. Like I've very frequently seen that a lot of these big companies will like not have the Gemini models, which are like, in my opinion, awesome for like the majority of work. But anyways, your third option was to use like public provider APIs or like have some kind of like pseudo enterprise deal. But regardless, it's not fully private. You're not going to really be able to run a whole lot of like actual sensitive data through it. Well, that has changed, meaning we now finally have all three. And that includes if you're just on like the builder plan, like the demo I'm going to show you is on a builder plan, and you can see I have pretty generous limits. So point being is now you can use it with a good developer experience. It's going to be secure, and the models are going to be very good at actually writing the code for calling these models, okay? Okay, so I'm not going to go too deep into what the AI SDK is, but high level, it's a very popular package, like 10 million downloads per week, completely open source. And it's a very thin wrapper around like the chat completions and the responses spec. What it does is it handles a couple of the nuances and complexities between jumping between those two specs, and also the nuances between the labs. And so everyone who standardizes around it has a very consistent experience. And ultimately that means you can swap providers very easily. You can swap like endpoints and variations of that very easily. And like it masks the kind of annoying parts of working with these endpoints, but it isn't a whole other language that you have to learn and debug and trace through when it fails, like something like LangChain is. So let's say that you're writing an app, and either when you're developing or if it's not a route that has to deal with very sensitive information, you can go directly through OpenRouter, right? And OpenRouter itself is going to have negotiations with all the major labs, and they'll have a bunch of other options here as well. But if you're in an enterprise, right, you're going to have to use something secure. In the case of all of the Palantir endpoints, they're all like zero data retention, and like some of the features like memory, which you can get typically like through the OpenAI ones, are not going to be available. And that's kind of what I have baked into this package. This package is very, very thin, right? All it's doing is setting a bunch of defaults, and I've gone through and like systematically tested every single one of them for various capabilities. And so like I've done that heavy lifting for you. That's what this is. So with that out of the way, let's get into an example. All right, so we'll start simple, right? I'll go into like what this like factory thing is later, but at a high level, right, this is the core code that you have to write to call one of these models. Okay, so we can just do that right now. So go. Yep, and so you're seeing the response here. Let me zoom a little bit. Okay, right, like this is the most basic one, but we're gonna get increasingly more complex, and I'll go through ones with like multiple providers as well. So let's go into a streaming use case. Obviously, like I've set defaults for a lot of these options, and like I've disabled farther down ones that like actually rely on features that just like aren't available, but you could override them if you wanted to. But let's just take this OpenAI example, right? Like you can set things like reasoning effort, text verbosity. Obviously in this example, right, I'm actually exposing two variations, and you can kind of like pick which one at runtime. And the Anthropic one, again, it's gonna have slightly different options here. Like I think they call their thing thinking, not reasoning, but effectively they're the same thing. But this is going to be for streaming, so... All right, and so you're seeing the results streaming back, okay? And I've like printed out everything with it, but obviously you would remove this if you weren't actually doing this in a development setting. So okay, right, like these are kind of like your table stakes, basic ones. Let's get into a little bit more of a complex one, and I'm actually going to first open this up and show you what that looks like. So this is a mechanism by which you can like debug your traces as you're running, and they'll be more handy as we go through more complex examples. And actually, this is going to be a good point to explain the DevTools instrumentation. So what's going to happen here is we're going to basically have middleware that's going to capture what the calls are going to be made. It's going to persist them locally in this like generations file, and then we have a simple endpoint where you can serve this up. This is only really for development. This is not like tracing that you would do with like Sentry or similar. So you have the DevTools instrumentation here, and then the other thing I'm going to briefly show you, so you have an understanding, is this provider registry. Let's say that you have multiple models that you want to invoke, right? You will register them using something like this, okay? And there's a couple other like helpers in here to make that a little bit easier, but that's the extent of what's happening. Okay, so let's get into the tool calling example. I'll explain what this is doing at a high level, and then we'll run it. So this is using Exosearch. I've registered a couple of predefined tools, or like pre-configured tools, which will have a couple of these set. It'll basically be a structured JSON object at the end of the day, but it's saved in Zod. And I will register that with the model. So when you actually call it, you're going to be able to like stream back the results. Okay. So let's run that one. I'll switch over to the other view so you can see what's happening. All right, and so you're seeing each of these individual calls being made. And obviously you're going to see like that same results coming back, and then the DevTools instrumentation will just make it easier if you're ever trying to like debug what is actually happening. Right, so in this case, right, the model had a couple of these like search tools that are registered to it, and it's making some progressive calls to invoke them. And it's kind of doing that of its own choice. The example is fairly constrained, right? Like I'm effectively telling it in advance what I want, but we'll go through some less constrained ones shortly, right? But at the end of the day, you get your full response back. You can inspect it here in a little bit more of a ergonomic view, or you can get the full like raw response information, right? And you're seeing this all print this way because this is streaming back. But obviously you're gonna be able to take this and do whatever you need to, or you can just view it in your console here. All right. Okay, so this example was more of what I'd call like just basic tool calling, but let's get into something a little bit more agentic. And so what we're trying to do here is we're going to say for each of these like 5 companies, go do some research on like what have they recently manufactured, what have they brought to market, what's in like late stage pipeline, and like if there's any obvious interest from people at this company in Palantir. Okay, and so it's going to go through that. It's going to have a couple of additional tool calls and some like breakouts that it needs, but at a high level, right, its end state is going to say, deliver me like a tight markdown snapshot. Okay, and so maybe your initial reaction is, oh, you could just like script this, right? And you absolutely could, but there's a second part here, which is if you spot something surprising or strategically notable, flag it and do like another round of research. And like that is where you're starting to get into that like more agentic like tool calling loop. It's obviously a very constrained example still, but it's getting a little bit closer, right? And so this is going to be using the tool loop agent. Tool loop agent is basically their tool calling, but they've encapsulated it a little bit better, right? And that's what it is. There's a couple of things that are more relevant if you're doing like a chat, right, where you need to like ask for approval or something. But otherwise, that's pretty much all this tool loop agent does. But obviously, the benefit is it's easy to import and like reuse in other parts of your code. Okay, and so that is the extent of this. And then you're obviously going to see some of the other tools here for like summarization. So let us run that. Okay, and I left a little bit of a hint in here in case you forget to like start this up. If you don't start this up, you won't lose the traces, but you won't actually be able to view them. Okay, so it's telling you what it's going to be doing. So let's switch over to this view so we can actually track that. All right, and so you're seeing a couple of things here, right? Obviously, it did a little bit of thinking, and then it's starting to fire off these like parallel search activities. And it's going to probably do a couple of rounds of that, do just more general research. It's then going to likely have like some kind of synthesis step where it's going to say, okay, I'm going to look at this information and say, what in this was like strategically relevant or notable, I think was. Okay, so maybe you're thinking, okay, that's pretty cool, but how do I actually get started? Well, the NPM package, I've actually created these skills, which have the actual like core set of examples that you're going to need. It's also going to have some information on like provider behavior, like what do you need to auth with, as well as like what are your peer dependencies that you're going to need. And speaking of which, the dependency strategy that I've taken is keep this as small and light as possible. Maybe you don't use all three of the models, right? And so you only install what you actually need, and that's all baked into the skill. So theoretically, at least, right, you can just tell your like whatever your Claude code to go install the provider, and probably will. Test results. Okay, so I have a huge suite of these like tests where I just like run them on repeat just to confirm which behaviors are actually working. Okay, this is going to be the full like catalog of models, and obviously this is going to be pulling live information, but it's saying, hey, which of these are experimental? I've tested Flashlight; it actually works great. A couple of the ones that are like truly sunset, like the Gemini 3 Pro. Actually, I guess they removed that from the list. But yeah, previously that was showing up, but I've actually like removed some of the ones that I've actually confirmed are just not working anymore. And so yeah, this should be a trimmed set of everything that is currently supported at the time of this release. All right, so if you're familiar with the Bloomberg terminal, they have this one feature, which is one that I've like always wanted, right? Like obviously I can't justify 40K just for something for fun. But like if you click on a company, right, you can see who are all the companies or like who are all its suppliers, as well as who does its supply. And you can immediately understand the value of that, which is like, hey, if there's a chip shortage, you know exactly where that's going to ripple out into. And you can say, okay, maybe there's another supplier that for whatever reason happens to have capacity, makes a fairly compatible chip. Boom, you know who's going to benefit, right? Like highly valuable. And the whole idea is, right, like if you have a huge corpus of information that's well structured, you can do a lot with it. And so I took that idea, but I was like, yeah, I can do that. And so I was like, how do we actually do that? And what I came to was if I took the original like parallel tool call example, and then I registered a couple of additional tools to it around like just like calling the FDA's website through their API and like filtering it down based on certain dimensions. I took those tools, registered it to the primary agent, and then I created a second agent, which would basically just like listen to the events coming off of it. It would summarize, and then it would graph that. And when I say graph that, I mean it has a couple of tools like I want to upsert a graph node, I want to link it, link the category, link the manufacturer, there's some deduplication, etc. Okay, took those two agents, and then we're going to start with a prompt, which is just like map the GLP-1 drug landscape, identify the major named categories first, the key manufacturers, etc. All right, so what you're going to see is the single rail research, and then switching over here, and you're seeing the view get regenerated. So what it's doing is it's analyzing, it's linking, and if you want to see what that looks like from here, right? And so you can see each of the individual tool calls, what is made for like, it's primarily like a drug for manufacturer up here, but you'll see like manufacturers for a category, your general web search, etc. And then you can kind of see the results of the research, and obviously there's a whole like transcript of information behind this, but you're effectively seeing the graph assemble in real time and it combining information from the primary agent as well as the graphing agent. All right, so I need to edit this video and probably go to bed, so see you in the next one.